I have the honor to introduce Jennifer Gooden, who will in turn introduce and moderate the next panel, Transboundary Conservation at the US-Mexico Border. Jennifer is the president of the Biophilia Foundation, whose primary mission is to support efforts that protect, restore, enhance, and preserve wildlife habitat for all species of native plants and animals. That's not a job description. I don't know what is. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Louise. This has been a fantastic lineup of speakers today, and I'm happy that we can join you here. As Louise mentioned, I'm with the Biophilia Foundation, and the arid borderlands region is one of our key focus areas. So I'm really excited about being here with our speakers today. In this final panel, we're going to shift our focus south to the US-Mexico border to hear from conservationists working in the Sky Islands, which is one of the most biologically and culturally diverse regions in temperate North America. So I will start out by introducing all three of our panelists now, then turn it over to them for presentations, followed by a discussion. So we will first hear from Louise Misztal, Executive Director at the Sky Island Alliance, a conservation organization working to protect and restore the diversity of life and lands in the Sky Island region. Louise has worked at Sky Island Alliance for the past 15 years, leading transboundary conservation and climate change adaptation initiatives. Following Louise, we'll hear from Juan Carlos Bravo, the Mexico Program Director for Wildlands Network. Juan Carlos coordinates the Borderlands Linkages Initiative and serves as secretary of the expert group for the conservation and sustainable management of jaguars and other wild felines. And finally, we'll hear from Jeremiah Leibowitz, Executive Director of Cuenca Los Ojos, where he oversees both the US and Mexico operations. He started his career in law, focusing on water law, real estate law, and estate planning for agricultural families. He's also worked for the Texas Agricultural Land Trust and as the conservation director for the California Rangeland Trust, helping landowners protect their lands throughout California. With that, I will turn it over to you, Louise.
Great, thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon. We're going to travel south now. I'm coming to you today from traditional lands of the Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui, which is now known as Tucson, Arizona. And I'm going to orient you to place in the Sky Islands here. So what are Sky Islands? They are forested mountains that rise up out of surrounding desert and grassland habitat. They can get up to 8,000 to 10,000 feet in elevation. And there's 55 Sky Islands in the Sky Island region, which we see here, located in southeastern Arizona and northern Sonora. You can see here that all the different influences coming together. So the Sky Islands are host to species that draw from all directions, from differing elevations and latitudes. The Rocky Mountains and Sierra Madre are on the north and south side, and the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts are converging here as well. And we also have a climatic phenomenon here known as a monsoon, where we get powerful thunderstorms in July and August. And all of these traits come together to create an astonishing diversity of life and habitats, like Jennifer said. This is a world-renowned biodiversity hotspot, recognized as such by Conservation International. And it's a complex conservation picture. You see the US-Mexico border running right through the heart of this ecoregion, and land management is a patchwork which necessitates conservation work occurring across boundaries and jurisdictions. But it is a wonderful connected ecoregion. You can see here, get the idea of that from this photo. And it's underpinned by the Madrean pine oak woodlands, which have been described as one of the best places in the biosphere by biologist and naturalist E.O. Wilson. So it's this really special place in the world where black bears and jaguars overlap. And it's the only place in the US where jaguars still roam freely. Many species here are at the edge of their range. The ocelot and white-nosed coati pictured here are examples. And there's just an amazing diversity. Roughly half the types of birds in North America live here, along with a myriad of bats, butterflies, hundreds of different solitary bee species, amphibians, and reptiles. And underpinning all of this diversity is water. Springs are really important in the region. There's thousands of springs like this one pictured on the left in Aravaipa Canyon that support wide-ranging mammals like the black bear, as well as endemic species like spring snails. And we have a number of transboundary rivers or streams like the San Pedro River pictured here, that flows north from headwaters in Sonora into the US, providing a ribbon of life and a corridor for wildlife movement. Overlaid on all of this amazing life and diversity is the climate emergency that we've certainly been talking about today. The past few years, we've seen temperatures reach extreme highs and heat waves persist longer. We've just come off of the record driest year in history, at least in Tucson. And we've watched entire Sky Island mountain ranges burn. So the importance of plants and animals being able to move around to respond to climate change is really forefront in terms of thinking about transboundary conservation in this region. And we also have in the region a border wall. You can see here the border wall built out of bollards at Coronado National Memorial. This is a wall that's incredibly impermeable to wildlife. They cannot get through this. And we've watched this wall construction proceed at a breakneck pace the last few years outside the rule of law, passing through national forest, national wildlife refuges, national monuments, and many other special places protected for their natural characteristics, as well as through OneonOne traditional lands, their sacred sites, and their burial grounds. And lots of damage has been done to the mountains here, the springs, and the region in building this wall that's completely cutting off wildlife corridors and waterways. And so when we look at these large issues of climate change, wildfires, border wall construction, and think about transboundary species like the jaguar, who I introduced you to earlier, requires working across boundaries at a much larger extent than that of individual management areas. And Sky Island Alliance, with our focus on protecting the entire Sky Island region, transboundary coordination and projects are a big part of our work. And one of the approaches we take is to determine what is at stake. So that's come up a lot today. If we're thinking about 30 by 30, we need to think about quality as well as quantity. So we need to know where the most important places are to protect. Our Spring Seeker project is an example of one of our transboundary projects where we're engaging an alliance of organizations and agencies to collect information at springs in Arizona and Sonora to help us understand the information we need to determine where the most important places are to focus. We also have a border wildlife study project where we've placed 58 cameras in one of the last remaining open cross-border corridors for wildlife in the Sky Island region. We're collecting data on the wildlife community there to document and share that with the public. We've already recorded 106 species in the last year through this study, really going back to the diversity of this area and the importance of this still open corridor for wildlife to move around in the region. And then finally, collaborative planning and cross-border collaboration is just a vital underpinning to all we do. To get to planning and action that's at a scale that's relevant to these ecological processes we're talking about, we have to work on both sides of the border and across jurisdictions. And so we seek to build a unified vision for this deeply interconnected landscape to bring local conservation efforts together into a bigger picture for greater impact. And that's vital for transboundary animals that we're working to recover and keep thriving, like the jaguar and black bear, so they have the connected open space they need. I will stop there. Pass it back to Jen.
Great, thank you. Next up, we will hear from Juan Carlos Bravo, the Mexico Program Director for Wildlands Network.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you all. Our organization works on the US and Mexico in advancing projects that promote large landscape conservation. And part of the focus of that is, I can't control my slideshow here. Part of the focus of that is, are some species that require a lot of land to move about. And so what we found in the borderlands is that a species that inspired international collaboration was the jaguar, the northern jaguar. Which we call it northern jaguar, not because it's distinct to other jaguars, but because it is at the limit of its range north. And so, yes, I can control it. Thank you. So I guess binational interest in borderlands jaguars conservation really started when a mountain lion hunter in 1996 was chasing what he thought was a cougar, ended up looking at a jaguar and taking a picture of it. That incident was soon followed by another incident that was very similar, another mountain lion hunter that faced the jaguar. In both instances, hunters put down their rifles and took pictures of the jaguar. And that sparked a lot of interest in the US in trying to figure out where jaguars fit in the landscape. And of course, people did remember that jaguars were part of the US landscape for many, many years before these two incidents. But a lot of that had been forgotten, and there was no clear idea of what the current situation was. And so Doctors David Brown and Carlos Lopez set out to document everything they could about jaguars in the borderlands. And they produced a book that is instrumental in understanding the species in this landscape. At the time, they realized, there were a number of things that they didn't know, but they were able to find out that there was a population of jaguars in central Sonora that was probably the one from where those two jaguars came. And so conservation groups met in 2006, and we created this rough map of what we knew of jaguars at the moment. That central area in green was vaguely identified, and the corridors through which jaguars were making it to the United States were also vaguely marked, as well as some of the jaguar records that we had. But there were, of course, more questions than answers at that point in time. I'll focus on 4 issues that were identified back then, which were how to protect the landscape, how to protect the corridors, how to protect the actual jaguars, the population, how many were there, and how to ensure that there are more of them. And then, though we didn't know at the time, we would have to face another issue, which was the border wall, as years moved on. And so the first issue of how to protect the jaguar's habitat was addressed, I believe, very successfully by what is known as the Northern Jaguar Reserve, a private lands conservation initiative currently managed by the Northern Jaguar Project. And this protects around 40 to 50,000 acres of jaguar territory where jaguars move about freely, breed, etc., and that provides a sanctuary for it. It further expands its conservation reach by collaborating with cattle ranchers in the vicinity. So that was addressed, and there are other instances where land is being protected for jaguars, but I think that this is the most notable one and certainly the largest. In terms of jaguar corridors, there were a lot of efforts to better map where those corridors were. Notable here are the 2015 attempt by Stoner and others to map these corridors for the Jaguar Recovery Plan by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's the map you're seeing on the left is what it shows, the actual document from the technical documentation of the Jaguar Recovery Plan. And another one that shows a lot more habitat, it was one done by David Theobald in 2017. And there have been, of course, other attempts at mapping jaguar corridors throughout these times. And so more recently, Wildlands Network convened a number of groups, including Louise's group, Skyline Alliance, Jeremiah's group, Cuenca Los Ojos, to try and revisit our understanding of jaguars. And you can see that old map in the upper left corner of the screen, and you can see an updated version with current information. It shows where the Northern Jaguar Reserve is and many of the collaborating ranches around it. It shows a simplified version of a number of these corridors as they were mapped, and a lot more records that we know of, notably many newer records in the US. along with other conservation ventures in the region that all add up to protect jaguar habitat on both sides of the border. And so we know where the corridors are. We are working piecemeal with the landowners to create stepping stones for jaguars to be able to move about. And when I say we, I mean a collaborative of groups that we call the Borderlands Linkages Initiative that brings together 7 different groups from the US and Mexico, and Wildlands Network helps with the coordination. And now we're trying to address as well the issue of what's with the jaguars, how many jaguars are there. And for that, we are starting with support from Biophilia Foundation, Wilberforce Foundation, and the Wallace Research Foundation, an attempt at monitoring jaguars consistently throughout different places around Sonora, the state of Sonora, where I live, and in Hermosillo, right here, which is the ancestral lands of the Yaqui, the Tohono O'odham, and the Comcac. This is the state of Sonora, and we've got all these different places where we're going to be monitoring simultaneously with camera traps using the exact same methodology to try and understand, can we figure out how many jaguars there are in Sonora? Because that's been a question that the international conservation community has been trying to answer for the last 20 years. And we can't really do it without solid, large-scale research. We have not reached the scale where we think we'd be able to answer that question, but we think of this year as a proof of concept kind of thing, where we'll see if we can all collaborate in putting together a research of this scale. And as I said at the beginning, after trying to address these 3 core issues of transboundary jaguar conservation, we now have to deal also with the border wall between Arizona and Sonora, and also New Mexico and Sonora. And to that effect, there is a coalition of probably around 40 groups working to stop and revert the border wall. And our collaboration in that has been focused on gathering very specific on-the-ground data. And people can look at the data that Wildlands Network collects on the border wall at the link at the bottom here. And if moderators would be kind enough to paste that link on the chat, people can also review it there. And you can look at that at the border wall exactly as it is built at the end of the Trump administration, where the gaps still remain, and what some places that we think ought to be restored soon are along the wall. And for researchers interested in using this data for any kind of work in support of borderlands connectivity, our organization can provide it to you upon request. So with that, I'd segue to Jeremiah so he can tell you more about his close experience with this monstrosity.
Fantastic. Thanks, Juan Carlos. I really look forward to seeing the results of that jaguar study. We'll next hear from Jeremiah Leibowitz, Executive Director of Cuenca Los Ojos.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I will let the screen pop up. I'll ask the IT folks if they can assist me with with forwarding slides. If you could see, we'll just go to slide 1 here. So as Jennifer said, my name is Jeremiah Leibowitz. I serve as the Executive Director for Cuenca Los Ojos. And first off, just want to thank the Salazar Center for convening this panel. And then for my colleagues, Louise and Juan Carlos, for kind of teeing up the broad the broad context of this region. And what I hope to present today is really just a microcosm of on the ground experience that we have as land managers of a preserve on the US-Mexico border. So this picture, one thing I've learned in being down here is this landscape is extremely photogenic, through a whole spectrum, whether it's the animals, the landscape, the weather, the mountains. And so as we all know, pictures tell a story much better sometimes than we can. And so I hope I can convey the beauty and the majesty of this landscape, but also talk about some of the real challenges, kind of where the proverbial rubber meets the road in some of the work that we do. Next slide, please. Okay, just to orient all the listeners as to where our preserve is located. We straddle Arizona and New Mexico. We've got approximately a 46-kilometer, that's right around 30-mile border with the United States. It's a very diverse border, very, very long, very rough topography, very rough landscape in certain parts. But when you think about private land conservation in Mexico, as well as the land conservation that's occurring across the border, we've got private preserves, we've got private landowners. We're working with federal agencies to the north. A lot of interested parties engaged in trying to preserve a lot of what Louise talked about and Juan Carlos brought your attention to related to corridors. And this is kind of where all of this stuff comes together on the ground. Next slide, please. So real briefly, in the landscape of what we're trying to do, Cuenca Los Ojos stands for Watershed of the Springs. And the premise guiding our work is the restoration of the historic cienagas or wetlands in this area. I've got 2 slides here to demonstrate kind of the scope and scale of some of the restoration work that we are engaged in on this preserve. Here you see an example of a gabion, or a rock erosion control structure held together by wire, strategically placed in what you can see is a pretty degraded stream bed. The incisions on the side of the bank are pretty rough. And so if we go to the next slide, our objective here is simply, when we get the rain events that we do, as Louise described, the monsoon season, it's a brief, but our rain comes very hard and very fast for a certain amount of time, and there's a tremendous amount of energy that goes through the landscape. And so our objective at CLO is simply, how can we figure out a way to harness that energy, slow the water down, get it to stay on the landscape longer. And as a result, this is an after picture of what a successful gabion looks like, and that we've been able to create a bunch of silt behind the gabion, thus slowing the water down, creating a sponge, which ultimately enables the water tables to rise, and then it precipitates a host of restoration processes from plants and wildlife all the way to just improve water infiltration into the water table. Next slide, please. Juan Carlos teed this up, and Luis also mentioned this, and this is where we are right now. However, from a land management perspective on the ground, we've got a new physical barrier to contend with, and it's definitely one that's new to us. It was one that we haven't had to contend with in the last 40 some odd years, but it's real, and it's got kind of a life of its own. And there's so many things that we are learning about its impact. Aside from the ones that you kind of hear about in the news, the animals are unable to migrate back and forth, the destruction and erosion issues that have resulted, due to construction. I've listed 4 kind of overarching challenges. Obviously, there are many more that we have to contend with, but connectivity has been discussed on this panel. Species migration is huge. Erosion, this picture demonstrates, you kind of see the full scope of the construction pads and construction equipment along the wall there to the right-hand side of the picture, which is the US side, and then Mexico to the left. But most recently, again, back to the monsoon issue, is flooding. So we can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to take everyone on a really focused segment of the wall. Recognize that our border spans almost 30 miles with the US, in which the border wall is mostly completed. And there are about 8 to 9 of these gate type structures in different washes across the border. Now, outside of monsoon season, typically these are closed and these are locked. And this is a Border Patrol, Department of Homeland Security oversight process, right? Well, in preparation for the upcoming monsoon season, decisions were made to open the gates at certain locations across the wall. And this picture represents a location called Silver Creek. And what's unique about this is I mentioned to you that species migration and wildlife corridors, the wall impacts that, and we don't know what those long-term impacts are. However, in the dialogue that we believe needs to occur, there's potential middle ground. So this gate, what this represents is simply the gate being open in preparation for flooding in the monsoon. Those gates you can observe are facing north to the US. And there's some barbed wire across the middle there to prevent our cows from going north and from our neighbors in the north from their cows coming south. I want you to pay attention to the level of the stream bed in relationship to the wall, because I'm going to make a comment about that here in a minute. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the same location, but on the north side, on the US side of the border. You can see after a rain event, just what the power of water and debris can do to a man-made structure. These gates are now off their hinges. Many of them are facing south. I can tell you that a handful of them have washed into Mexico, and we have not been able to locate them yet. So this is a new dynamic that we are going to have to contend with from a land management standpoint, going back to the gabions that I previously described in my presentation, as to strategically, how are we going to restore this watershed in light of this new impact with the wall and its influence on major rain events and its effect on the watershed. So go forward one slide, please. This just shows, if you can, the water after the rain. If the two pictures back, you saw me looking north. This is where I would have been standing. Okay. What I don't have a good picture of is to show that once these waters have receded, the devastation, the amount of erosion, the elevation change between the base of the wall and into Mexico is now 6 to 8 feet of new erosion washout that has occurred as a result of this flood event. That's a new problem for us to deal with, and so as we go forward in our management decision making, this was just one isolated example in Silver Creek. As I mentioned, there's 8 to 9 different locations. Depending on where the rain falls, we could have other catastrophic type of flood events that we are now going to have to contend with. Next slide, please. So where are we headed? I've put kind of a laundry list of bullet points that, from a management, a land manager decision standpoint, that we are contending with. Obviously, I've discussed the riparian restoration is a huge component of what we do. Another call out I'll briefly discuss involves carbon sequestration. When we talk about transboundary conservation, there's a significant amount of work that we and others are doing right now, obviously in Canada, the US, and Mexico, and around the world, to figure out the role that grasslands and landscape scale conservation can play in carbon sequestration. And we're very engaged in those discussions to see what sort of solutions we can bring to the table. Next slide, please. Another project that we have recently stepped into is the assistance of managing another preserve in the state of Chihuahua, which is south of where our current preserve is located. And one of the earlier speakers, I think right before this presentation, talked about the bison herds that used to go north to south across the border. Well, this project involves the restoration of grasslands in Chihuahua, combined with the management of an introduced bison herd. And a unique challenge there for us is recognizing that bison in Mexico are an endangered species, whereas in the United States, they actually can be managed as livestock. The point I want to make here is simply that when you look at where our current preserve is in Sonora, where this preserve is located in Chihuahua, there's a significant landmass in between, some of which was represented in Juan Carlos's presentation, where we start to connect larger landscapes, establishing corridors, connectivity, and again, CLO's role in all this is the actual on-the-ground land management component of these larger restoration efforts. Next slide, please. And it goes without saying, partnerships. I'm a huge A-Team fan, and so that was my little attempt at some humor. I found it funny at the time. But you see north and south, Mexico, US, nonprofits, federal, state entities, and this is just a small microcosm of everybody that's engaged working on this southern boundary. It takes a huge effort, and I'm grateful for our partners in the folk, Luis's Sky Island and Wildlands Network that Juan Carlos is representing. Without the dialogue that we all share, the efforts and the progress that we've made thus far, we would be unable to continue into the future. Next slide, please. Okay, so with that, Jennifer, just a quick overview of kind of an on-the-ground example of what we're doing for transboundary conservation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeremiah. And thank you to Louise and Juan Carlos for those presentations. They bring up so many really interesting issues that are ripe for discussion here. I think I'll start with a question for Jeremiah. Jeremiah, you talked about the impact of the U.S.-Mexico border wall on your work at Cuenca Los Ojos, and that the construction of an expansion of this border wall takes place in the context of land degradation and fragmentation that's been occurring in the borderlands for 200, maybe 300 years. Is it possible to leverage current attention on the border wall to engage people beyond it into the broader need for landscape scale restoration and biocultural conservation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Jennifer. And the short answer is yes. I think, the unfortunate part about the polarizing nature of the border wall, a lot of what is conveyed in the news and the attention that it currently gets is obviously centered around other very important social issues related to immigration, security, and what have you. Most of which we observe currently, affecting Texas and that region of the border. But the reality is yes, we believe that the attention that is focused there needs to be expanded, because while there is also a human component and plight to what the wall represents, the environmental side and just the biodiversity side of the attention we could bring to protecting this landscape, I think we're in a very good position to have a much larger dialogue with interested stakeholders to expand it just beyond the immigration challenges that obviously everyone is familiar with, and recognize that the immigration challenges, the environmental challenges, the biodiversity challenge, all of those can be part of the same conversation. And I think now is an apropos time to engage in those conversations.
Thanks. And along the same lines, Louise and Juan Carlos, in your presentations, you talked about a range of other challenges to conserving and restoring the Sky Islands and the borderlands. We talked about climate change. Jeremiah's mentioned security threats. There's also a popular image of the border that's not necessarily consistent with the ecological richness that really exists there. No doubt our job as conservationists and restorationists is complicated by these challenges. But I wonder, are there any opportunities hidden in these obstacles? For example, could the challenges be used to demonstrate nature-based solutions or test ways to build resilience or positive peace?
You go ahead, Louise.
Okay. Well, I'm struck today, sitting through the symposium, by the juxtaposition of the 30 by 30 goals with the border wall, which creates kind of extreme dissonance, really. I think it's so important that we protect places, and yet we have these places in the nation that have already been protected and are being run over by border wall construction. And so I guess I just want to go back to the importance of supporting policies to ensure that these places that we're seeking to reach 30 by 30 goals with are truly protected, and we're providing for quality of habitat, quality of carbon sequestration, quality corridors that wildlife can actually use with water to drink and all the important pieces they need. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to look beyond sort of a footprint of protected areas and think about where we're going with the 30 by 30 goals and the overall intent of protecting biological diversity. I also think there's a lot of opportunity for reframing, what's going on at the border, led by the great work, transboundary work that's been done on the conservation front. From how I see it, we don't have a border crisis. What we have is a displacement crisis that's related very much to climate change and other big issues that we've been talking about today. And if we think much bigger picture about those things, it takes us down a different path of solutions.
I'd like to add on a more on the ground kind of thing that we have noticed, a number of partners are collaborating strongly with cattle ranchers in an effort to protect large carnivores. And one usually thinks of large carnivores being incompatible with cattle ranching, but there's been a lot of progress done by groups such as Profauna and Northern Jaguar Project in bringing about a change of heart in relationship to the presence of jaguars, cougars, and other species in the region. So there's those opportunities, and I think there's a lesson there to learn. You know, if you can think of something more apparently opposed as cattle ranching and large carnivore conservation, and yet people have been able to find common ground and solutions moving forward. I think that's exactly the kind of examples we ought to be following.
Yeah, and particularly important given the high prevalence of private land and communal land in northern Mexico, that we're able to work with private landowners whose primary purpose for their land might not be conservation, but whose land uses are consistent or can support it. We heard a lot this morning about collaboration across the US-Canada border, and our 4 organizations, amongst many others, have been vocal about the need for collaboration across the US-Mexico border as well. I'd like to dive a little more deeply into that. Why is it that, I'll say, trinational collaboration, including the tribal nations, why is that trinational collaboration necessary to produce durable conservation outcomes? I'll leave it to any of the 3 of you who'd like to answer.
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. Governments have resources that are way beyond what our organizations can put forth, and as was mentioned in the previous panel, this kind of conservation effort needs funding, and there has to be a commitment to invest public resources in things that promote public benefits. So that's definitely one of the reasons, and we definitely need to see more engagement between federal and state agencies in the U.S.-Mexico border. That has been shut down in the past several years, and it doesn't seem to be ramping up at the speed of other efforts of this new U.S. administration. So there's the issue of funding for sure, and then there's also the issue of vision. You know, governments in a sense are tasked with putting forth a collective vision of what the community wants, and whether they do that effectively or not, the truth is that they have a huge influence on that vision, and we're not seeing that vision of collaboration being put forth. A lot of it is grassroots, and there's like you've mentioned, our 4 groups and others collaborating at the ground level. But we do sense the lack of a more decisive effort from government agencies in the U.S.-Mexico border, and certainly the inclusion of native peoples. The Sky Islands region, at least on the Mexico side, does not have active, vibrant native communities, but there are other places along the border that certainly have native communities that should be allowed to lead the way in making decisions for the management of the landscapes there.
I can add that toward that goal of cross-border collaboration, and I see in our comments here a recommendation that we use the word international rather than binational or trinational. Toward that goal, your organizations are also involved with this coalition of a couple of dozen regional conservation and tribal organizations who endorsed a proposal to the Biden-Harris administration outlining a strategy for landscape scale restoration in the borderlands. So I'll see if we can post a link to that in case any of our viewers are interested. We'll post that in the chat box. And with that, we've also recently completed a report assessing the restoration skills and capacities of regional organizations doing on the ground work in the border states as a as a way of facilitating cross-border collaboration. Sure, anyone is welcome to contact me if they'd like to learn more about that. If we have a question from the audience, how can lessons learned from the Sky Island effort be translated to other US-Mexico border conservation efforts? We're all from the Sky Islands here, so if anyone would like to, to talk a little bit outside our range.
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at it, Jennifer. Yeah, I think one of the main focus points for CLO is to serve as that on-the-ground laboratory for trying these sorts of restoration efforts. So, there's been talk about, Louise mentioned how they've got a program with camera traps that are trying to identify where the crossings for certain animals. Juan Carlos's organization is doing some significant work with jaguars. CLO has over 200 some odd cameras throughout its landscape. So that's just one example. The gabions I talked about. Our goal is to do this. We have the laboratory. We're fortunate enough to have a landscape where we can experiment. We can try new things. And if they fail, we can communicate that to the broader region as to, maybe the road that you don't want to go down. But where we do have successes, our main goal is to figure out how can we extrapolate those positive improvements in a cost-effective manner that other folks can replicate. And so that has been part of our history for the last 40 years. But we have the benefit of having the ability to experiment in a place right here on the border wall, the border region that could be, not supplemented, but just broadcast throughout the landscape. We're not doing something in an area that other folks can't relate to. If it works where we're working, our hope is that throughout this border region, it could be applicable.
Yeah, and I would jump in and add, in terms of a lesson learned, there's a long history in the Sky Island region of working to develop a shared identity for the region across the border, to understand the biodiversity of the region in a really cooperative way, partly through these conferences that started getting convened maybe 20 years ago now, to bring shared identity in terms of really calling this place the Sky Island region, elevate that name. I think that kind of big picture shared vision is so important, because the scale at which we implement conservation is just not, you just are not implementing at the landscape scale when you're doing restoration projects and these studies and things like that. And so it's so vital that these different pieces of work are fitting into this bigger understanding of an interconnected region and a shared vision, and that we understand these species that really do need the cross international, cross borders approach to conservation, and fit the pieces of what everyone's doing together and to have the greatest impact.
Okay, well, I think we have time for one more question. Tomorrow's agenda has some focus on climate change, so we can talk about that a little bit, and to shift our attention to thinking about issues of climate change. And we have a question from the audience asking how lessons learned from the Sky Island effort, oh, sorry, the different one. A question asking how climate change will force many humans and other species to move, and are we ready with conservation designs? And I'll piggyback on that by saying that in many ways, the Southwestern US and Northern Mexico are at the forefront of climate change. And if we look at the borderlands as a case study of the future, especially given the unique geography and topography of the Sky Islands, what can be learned from our experience?
I'd like to touch on how a lot of our work around a charismatic species like the jaguar might look like. It's the usual conservation project, but in trying to protect these north-south corridors for the species, what you're actually doing is establishing a network of safe havens for all kinds of species to move through the landscape as climate is modified. We also want to see, kind of trigger the dynamics that are in play when you have conservationists talking one-on-one to landowners. And that this is particularly important in Mexico, like you, Jen, and Louise were mentioning, the mosaic of tenure we have in Mexico, where there's very little public land, makes it imperative that any kind of adaptation to climate change or biodiversity, extinctions, et cetera, have to take into account private landowners. And so this one-on-one kind of work that we're promoting is going to be instrumental in doing other things to address climate change, like protecting rivers and streams and other water sources for wildlife that will need that as the landscape becomes drier.
Jennifer, if I could just add on the to amplify what Juan Carlos said. One thing I've observed is this landscape is, despite being in the desert, right? What we typically see as a desert. Obviously, the pictures that have been shown are not your traditional desert, but it's pretty resilient. Once it's given an opportunity to heal it, it's extremely hardy. The plants and animals that live down here, they've had to adapt, over millennia to survive. But my observation as we manage Cuenca Los Ojos is simply, are we going to be able to do what we need to do fast enough to ensure that we can kind of get ahead of the changes that are happening right now? The work that for corridor expansion, for the safe havens that Juan Carlos talks about, we are actively working as fast as we possibly can. And I just wonder, is that speed going to keep up with the actual changes that are going to happen within the climate and with the environment? TBD at this point for us, but it's something we're concerned about.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think something that's been vital in our work in the region in terms of adaptation, and I think is really important in other places, is this combination of resistance strategies, keeping water, or something that's really important for biological diversity there on the landscape as best we can with restoration and other techniques, while we transform in a larger landscape and think about where are things going to be moving and how do we soften the transition. So that kind of matrix of resistance in really important places and then helping things transform at the larger landscape is important.
I think that's been one of the really interesting lessons that has come out of the large-scale restoration done by Cuenca Los Ojos and other organizations in the region, is seeing that the very measures that can be put in place, relatively low-tech measures and methods that are easily replicable without even by private landowners, or without degree in ecological restoration, these can have profound impacts on allowing nature to bounce back. And those impacts are not only on wildlife and on landscapes, but research has shown that there has been a significant impact on drought resilience, on resilience to flood, and to other factors that will help not only nature thrive, but also help our communities in the region thrive. We're at the end of our time here now. So with that, I'd just like to thank each of you for your presentations today. And I'd also like to thank the Salazar Center for hosting this panel.